أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه وخاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيد الأولين والآخرين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين اللهم صل على ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. Jazakallah, first of all, for inviting me for this 4-part series. Of course, we are commemorating Lady Khadija, salamullahi alayha. Salat, please, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And it is, of course, a sad occasion. But as I have promised, and in talking with some of the committee as well, that I will respect the personality for the first sort of 5 minutes, give a spiritual anecdote, but then deal with the topic at hand, which is Islam in the West, conflict and challenges, inshallah. And I know, of course, people may be discussing having shorter fasts and all this, but one good thing is that you can have shorter lectures at least. So, everybody wants to eat. It's good to have lectures in Ramadan, inshallah. And I know you don't have many lectures, so inshallah we can just focus a bit for 20-25 minutes. I won't take too much of your time, inshallah. I'm also hungry, yeah? Okay. So first and foremost, just to give a little context, when we talk about Islam and the West, in fact, in talking about this dear personality, Lady Khadija, she's actually a very beautiful voice for this debate, because in this debate, one of the misconceptions occurs is about our dear Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is often degraded. Either he is, astaghfirullah, a womanizer, either he is a warmonger, either he is not really a prophet, either he is a magician, etc. But what does his dear wife say upon their marriage? He says, or she says to him, that, O son of my uncle, I desire you fundamentally, one, because you are akin with me, or you are part of my kinship. And I desire you because you are a dignified man. And I desire you because you are trustworthy, that you have a beautiful character, and you have a beautiful speech. And she is rarely mentioned, to be honest, when we talk about debates pertaining to the Prophet or Islam in the West. But isn't it interesting that his dear wife, and the most beloved, to be honest, speaks about the dear Prophet in the greatest way possible? And especially when we talk about Ramadan, in amongst all of the du'as that we do, and of course they're very beautifully recited here, in amongst all of the du'as that we do, the fasting, the salah, arguably the greatest goal that we should have in Ramadan is to have moral consistency. Salawat, please. This Ramadan shouldn't be in the summer, hay fever. Okay. So one of the beautiful things that we do gain from Ramadan, or should gain, is having moral consistency. And I always tell myself that, to be fair, completing fasts, completing amals, completing du'as is rather secondary. If after Ramadan I have gained a quality in myself where I don't backbite, or I actually keep promises, or I speak softly to people, then my Ramadan has been successful. Because after all, what we want is the character of the Prophet as outlined by this great lady. If, as the Quran says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, innaka la'ala khuluqin azim, Allah attests that the Prophet has this mighty disposition. This is what we should be aspiring to. And let us not forget that it was not just the Prophet that had this disposition, it was Bibi Khadija. For the Prophet said after she died, he said, he has not compensated me with someone better than her. She believed in me when all others disbelieved. She held me truthful when others called me a liar. She sheltered me when others abandoned me. She comforted me when others ridiculed me. And Allah granted me children by her while depriving me of children by other women. This is the greatest accolade that a husband can give a wife, whether we give that. And second thing is that what we also find is not just the support which is often mentioned with Lady Khadija, but the intellectual insight which she had. It was her intellectual conviction and moral conviction in supporting our dear Prophet. She was not just a secondary role. She actively played a role in promoting Islam, not just through her wealth, but by accepting Islam. Therefore, when we do remember this great lady, let us give her her due. She is the moral voice of the Prophet. She is the person that sacrificed her wealth. And she also, like the Prophet, had this moral disposition. Salawat, please. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevate her stations, and may we always remember her, inshallah. Now on to this debate, or rather this theme, Islam in the West, conflict and challenges. Why have I chosen it? Well, we recently had, unfortunately, the event of the Woolwich murder. But for one of the first times, we also saw some debates happening within the Shia and wider Muslim community, of course, which is that there were debates about standing up for Islam. And these go around in YouTube, whether that happens in Jamaats, communities, or universities. And we had people from our own sect debating, like such as Mehdi Hassan or Aman Akshawani, for example. And of course, within the wider Muslim community, we also had much more of a unified view. And these were wonderful things which occurred because they gave more of a nuanced voice about exactly what Islam was. However, what I would like to do in the 4 lectures is look at the theoretical points of conflict between Islam and the West. Meaning that the usual arguments are cited. Well, it's not the problem with Islam, it's the problem with Muslims. And we also give these reasons. We say, well, actually it was just a bunch of radical Muslims that did these things. We also say, oh, look at the wonderful contributions that Islam made in the past from Ibn Sina, or exchange of knowledge, etc. Or from Abbasid period when there were some exchanges in Baytul Hikmah, etc. So what we do is we often give arguments from the past, and we also say, we often say that it is the problem with Muslims, not Islam. And moreover, we often say that Islam is a peaceful religion. Islam means peace. Now, when I was listening to these, part of my research over the last 4 years in my PhD has been this, part of it. And I actually think that it is not just these arguments which are the problem. There are some legitimate criticisms which non-Muslims or those people that apparently hate Islam give. They are legitimate to a degree, by the way, but it doesn't give anybody the right to discriminate against Islam or Muslims, hence Islamophobia. I know that you did have some debate or some question time about Islamophobia a couple of months ago, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I'll just deal with that very briefly. But I actually think that there is some issue with the world view of West and world view of Islam. It's not just, people understand that Islam means peace. I mean, people already know there was some exchange of knowledge. We don't need to mention, people already understand these things. The issue is this. The issue is the threat that they see of Islam today. So, let me just tell you something. Is Islam a meaningful world religion today? Is it? All religions will provide a spiritual dimension to their followers. Christianity will do that, Judaism will do that, Buddhism will do that, we will do that. This is why we're gathered today in Ramadan. Is that really a threat to them? That's not really a threat to them. The threat, essentially, is whether our sources, whether Quran and Sunnah, are meaningful in contributing to the economy, in contributing to professions, in contributing to commerce, in contributing to trade, in contributing to identity. So when people say British Muslim identity, when people talk about jobs or a very hard economy, the issue with the perception of Islam is whether it can contribute meaningfully in this environment and whether we are coming up with answers or solutions today. This is one issue. So this is not just something to do with what's happening in the past. It's a theoretical and practical issue about our identity today. And the second thing to do with the debate is to do with duality, which is that people like to say that Islam is one thing and of course Western another. And this is where we bring up our great scholars, Ibn Sina, Ghazali, or many other people that somehow have contributed to Western development. So the other issue is purposefully trying to say that Islam is here and West is here. So the purpose of these lectures is to say, well, what are the points of conflict? It is not just that people are uneducated about Islam. Those of you who have watched so many YouTube videos about these debates, people are rather sophisticated. People do understand actually that Islam has a contribution to make. But the issue is whether it can make a meaningful contribution today. Salawat, please. So the first lecture will actually be about perception and about Islamophobia. And next week, whenever, I can't remember the dates, but whenever you've invited me, I'll go on to other dimensions, which is the issue of dialogue, the issue of the westernization of Islam, and the issue of frameworks of Islam. And these are things which we may not always hear within the debates, but I do feel that those people, whether you may say Douglas Murray or many other people, I think that the arguments they're making are to do with whether Islam is meaningful today, not rather what it has contributed in the past, which are where we draw most of the arguments from. So the first thing, rather, what is the perception of Islam today? And this unfortunately is the perception that Islam is barbaric, is terrorist, is uneducated, demeaning to women, isolationist and out of place in the modern society. Now this is the usual thing that we hear. Is it true? Well, partly or most in part, as a theoretical religion, of course, it is not true that we often say it promotes peace. But today, if we are talking about its role in a global environment, and whether we are saying that Islam can produce an alternative economy, or alternative to the capitalist system, or alternative to maybe teaching and secular models in university, then yes, we have an issue whether Islam is making an active contribution. This is one thing. However many scholars we have in fiqh and theology, there is some legitimacy to this criticism. Whether we are producing any meaningful scholarship, any meaningful views to current trends which are affecting us. So this thing is actually meaningful. What is not meaningful and what perhaps is wrong is to say that this religion has come out to terrorize people, of course, and this is the argument that you all know. And the second thing, which is rather interesting, we will always say that Quran and Sunnah are meaningful to us. But this is a point of conflict, because for the last 70 years, and as the development of human rights has occurred, human rights say what? That ultimately human beings have an independence in decision making. We do not need God anymore, and we do not need scripture. But what do Muslims say? Muslims will say what? That Quran is always meaningful and Sunnah is always meaningful. So the conflict fundamentally is people who say or attack Islam will say, why do you want to follow this Quran? Why should it be meaningful today when women themselves work and have dignity anyway? So why do you want to use this Quran? Therefore, it's a conflict to do with sources. It's a conflict with Parliament and Quran, or Parliament or free human decision making and an apparently out of date scripture. This is what is happening in those people's minds that perhaps wish to attack Islam. So therefore, the debate relies more so on whether we are finding our sources to be continually meaningful. And a third point. The third point is to do with history, in fact. We may often say that haters of Islam began since 9/11 or 9/11. Is that really the case? Is it the case that media has promoted the hatefulness of Islam? In some respects, yes. But I would like to share with you one scholar who the Islamic Human Rights Commission gave me the opportunity to review. And you may have come across him. His name is Saeed Reza Amali. He published a book which they gave me to review, and thankfully to them I had the opportunity to review it, called The Western Academic Perspective on Islam, Muslims and Islamic Countries. And I must thank them and thank him because I want to bring in his argument here. He gives three initial arguments as to why Islamophobia started. Before I give these arguments, what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia, according to the Runnymede report of 1997, suggests that Islamophobia means the fear or dislike of all or most of Muslims, and that Islam is monolithic, inflexible, distant, and an intolerant religion. That's what Islamophobia is. And where did it start? Interestingly, Islamophobia has its roots in the Prophet inviting the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius to Islam. That, according to him, is the root of Islamophobia. Why? The Prophet is doing a wonderful thing by inviting somebody else to Islam. Where does Islamophobia come in here? Because at that point, when arguably Christianity was seen as a world religion, that invitation was an attack to the world dominance of Christianity. So the Prophet simply saying that I invite you to what is now known as a purer form of submission was a threat. So Islamophobia is not a modern hatred to Islam. Rather, it is a gripe to do with why the Prophet invited somebody else to Islam. This is the first point. And the second point, one figure where perhaps many of the commentators that draw upon their literature of hate towards Islam is Saint John of Damascene, who lived during the middle of the 8th century. His works still have relevance today. So when people say, well, there are verses in the Quran which promote violence, it is because of this person why they still draw upon this literature. And Saint John Damascene, who perhaps existed during 6th, 7th, 8th Imam's time, said the following. Amali says, the real founder of the Christian tradition against Islam claimed that the Quran imitated the Old and the New Testament incompletely, and this was to become a pillar of the Christian accusations against Islam as a false religion in the centuries to come. We believe in the Quran, yes, but people who say that Islam is a religion of hatred, they really don't give the Quran its worth. Why? Because they say that ultimately Islam really is a copy or a product of Old and New Testament. Patricia Crone, I think the namaz is early. I know. Maybe somebody wants to eat. Okay. There's adhan going off in the mobile. So, what is occurring is that these debates or these perceptions of Islam as a religion of hatred is fundamentally to do with writings which existed in the middle of the 8th century, which basically try to take the credibility away from the Quran, that the Quran was not a miraculous book. And you will find, today, if you go in SOAS, for example, Patricia Crone, who often comes there, basically says this, that Islam is a product of Christian and Jewish history. So one of the things that we have to perhaps be forward-thinking of, which we don't really mention in our debates, is why is it that this criticism is there, that the Quran is not a miraculous book? We should actually be giving this argument, although we don't give it. We believe it's an assumption. But there are those commentators don't actually believe in it. And the third thing, we often find today with YouTube and movies that the innocence of the Muslim trailer, which occurred in 2012, I believe, basically those of you who saw it, was absolutely disgusting, that the Prophet was a womanizer and a warmonger. Where did this start from? Amali argues the following. In Al-Andalus, which some people say was a time where Muslim, Christians and Jews lived peacefully, there was an underground movement where people started writing and painting about Islam, trying to say that it was indeed a barbaric religion, which is exactly what the media draws upon today. And what did they say? They said the Muslim Prophet was a licentious Arab who promoted lust in the form of polygamy. So this was in Al-Andalus. And the Crusades, it wasn't just a matter of war, but also a matter of intellectual propaganda. And they said the following, that the image of a savage, dark-skinned Saracen started from the Crusades. He was a pagan enemy of Jesus Christ. And he was there in order to keep the flames of war high. And it wasn't just the Crusades which addressed this, but after the Crusades, it came into the mainstream religion of Christianity, and in Christian literature, they portrayed the Prophet as this. What I'm just simply trying to share with you is the debates, at least which I have seen, which are wonderful to their right, I believe, have a greater root. And I think we should be more sophisticated when we have the opportunity and attack those who start to give these subtle arguments about barbarism. And actually, we should be speaking about the history of these and the roots of these and identifying figures who actually started this literature. Because once you mention Saint John of Damascene or you mention dates, then we are forward looking, because we're trying to say, well, this is where your source is, because often their sources will be these things. Salawat, please. Now, these few points which I'm giving, I know in Ramadan, I'm trying to go as fast as possible, and I would like to go even deeper, but the fundamental point I'm trying to illustrate is we're not dealing with a modern conflict, we're dealing with a historical conflict. And two, we're also dealing with an issue of identity, an issue with whether Islam, to be honest, is an active and meaningful religion. We have this mosque, and that's very wonderful, but to be honest, other followers of other religions will get their spiritual dimensions. So rather, the issue is whether Islam in a globalized world is providing modern solutions all the time. And therefore, our task is, to be honest, as I've described before, to come up with perhaps new financial models, new models of leadership, and such forth. What is the conclusion that Amali makes? Now, this is where there is a very strong trend occurring. Now, whenever we may watch perhaps Question Time, and we may look for arguments which are defending Islam, we may watch YouTube, etc. Why is it that Islam has an interest within the media? It's not just the media that is actually fueling things. In academia or Western academics has a link with media and government. Why? Because that is the primary route, the primary base of knowledge by which all journalists may get their information from, and that's something which you all know. What is actually happening in academia? This is the basis, okay? Amali says that he analyzed 23,872 works in Western academia that talked about Islam and Muslims and Muslim countries, okay? He said that out of all of these works, 3,199 works, which is 13.4%, bear the label of Islamophobia. And this figure, 13.4%, is rising. And when I analyze the graphs and all that, I think it will rise to 20 or 25%. So let's say, for example, maybe in the next 10 years or 5 years, a quarter of what we may read, a quarter of what people may study at university, a quarter of the books in your average library will be fundamentally against Islam, whether in a subtle way or an overt way. When I was reading these figures, I was rather startled, because what's actually happening is there is a very firm link between providing media or providing those aspects of government with the relevant information to actually attack Islam, and therefore we are always on the back foot, always. And that's why we will always say, but actually we are the ones that, yes, contributed to science, we are the ones that contributed to society today through architecture, etc. But I really feel these arguments are now waning. And that's why I mentioned just a few arguments, where we should actually look back in history as to where Western academics, at least those who are hatred of Islam, are getting their sources from. If we are not doing that, then I do sincerely feel that we are rather far behind, because we'll always then go and defend Islam. Why can't we be rather proactive and say, actually, now we want to do a re-evaluation of Western history of Islam, like this great scholar has done, in order that we take the debate to them. Salawat, please. Okay, I'll just do maybe 3-4 minutes more, and then people can break for wudu, inshallah. Just as a conclusion, and then what I'm going to speak next week. What I hope to have illustrated, I just wanted to give you a flavor of maybe some of the good research that is happening where it is trying to put Muslims on a more proactive foot. And I don't always feel we are doing that. You may disagree with me, but I feel we are often, being debated against, and therefore we have to cite the usual arguments. and we don't always do our own pieces of research and say where in the 7th century or 8th century did these writings come from. And I think it is our duty to do that. And second, it is our duty to say, well, people who criticize Islam, fine, that's up to them, but it doesn't give any right to discriminate. But some of the criticisms may be correct, and I do believe a few are, which is that I don't think we are basically coming up with anything meaningful in terms of scientific or political advances. And you may disagree with me there, but that is one thing. Inshallah, next week, I want to deal with the issue of dialogue, which is how Islam and West have dialogue with each other, what are the pitfalls, what are the positives, inshallah. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He forgives us in this month, and whatever small I have said, inshallah, has been accepted by the Almighty. Surah Al-Fatiha, please.